The series has been on the topic of Kabbalah and mysticism, but brought down in a way that it is comprehensible and sometimes accessible and practical. So we spoke about the duality of existence and how we see that playing out in things like politics and parenting and all that stuff. We've seen numbers as they're expressed in the Torah, in life, and the patterns that they suggest and evoke. And if we recognize those patterns, then we can start to manipulate them. We can start to use them to our advantage and to follow in the pre-arranged structures of the universe that will allow us to flourish. We spoke a little bit about numerology, right? Gematria. We also spoke about the deeper hidden messages and meanings of the Hebrew alphabet. We touched a little bit last week on the concept of the afterlife and what that looks like. And so now, today, the thrilling conclusion will be answering the question which has plagued many people throughout history, which is, if we conceive of God to be a perfect being, and by the way, that's not a given assumption. We have to maybe prove that God is perfect, and to define perfection, because that's also a difficult word to use. But if God is whole, perfect, lacking nothing, right, then it would seem that God has no need to do anything in order to be more whole or more perfect. If that's true, then how do we account for the existence of us? At what point did God say, you know what? We just need a little bit more salt in the recipe, right? Just a touch more ginger. Yeah, we need a little bit more universe to make things, and then it'll be really good. It was already entirely, absolutely perfect as could be, and then God's like, yeah, but. So what was that, yeah, but? What just happened? It was already good. It was already great. It was perfect. There was nothing else. So a being that has no lack, theoretically, would need nothing. And yet here we are. And he clearly wanted us to be here. So how do we account for that? That's the question. Does anybody not understand the question? Or anyone want to define the question, or help me, or anyone need me to kind of restate the question to make it a little bit more? No, we're good with the question? Good. 7 years in this country, and I still just can't get over the blank expressions on the. I speak to students in America, and they were like, "Rabbi, you blew my mind. That was incredible!" Right? And then I'll give the most amazing talk, to a bunch of English students, and they will sit there, and then one of them will say, "Rabbi, you should know that was the most life-changing experience I've ever had." And it's like, could you show a little bit more emotion then? It's like, but okay, fine, I'll take it. So everyone's okay with the question. It's a solid question. Why are we here? What need does God have of our existence? That's the question. Now, just to flesh out our assumptions, this idea that God is perfect, right? So we have spoken about the two-sided nature of reality, the threefold patterns and the fourfold patterns in the universe, but ultimately it all originates at one single source. That's monotheism, right? And it would seem to make sense because, logically speaking, if you go back far enough, there's usually one cause to everything, and that was the argument of several philosophers. It's called the first causer, right? The first mover argument for the existence of God. There's a lot of proofs for the existence of God, but I don't want to get into that. The idea is that if we posit that there is a single source of all of reality, then it is impossible that God could be lacking anything. How does that work? Anyone want to give it a shot? How does monotheism imply necessarily that God is perfect, lacking nothing? Come on, you can't just sit there. You got to use your brains. What?
If God wasn't, then there'd be another one. And
Good.
therefore it wouldn't be monotheistic.
Yes. If God was not perfect, then that means that there would be something outside of God. Right? There'd be something that God does not possess. There's something that is, there's the set of God, and then there's outside of that set. That would mean God lacks. So, and then all of a sudden, now you would imagine, well, there's some larger substrate, right, in which this small God and this other thing all exist, and then that thing is really God, right? So, however you slice it, when you say there's one source to everything, then that must mean by definition that God is perfect, which, by the way, answers the question that a lot of people have is, how do we know God is good? Because there are some people out there who say that maybe God's not perfectly good. The answer is, if you're a unity, then it's actually impossible for you to be evil. Because evil implies that there's something outside of you. But I don't know if we're going to get into that. Yeah.
So can God create a task that God can't do?
Can God create a rock he cannot lift?
That
Good question. So Maimonides gives an answer to that, and he suggests that the question itself is a nonsensical question. It's like asking, can you create a triangle that's a square? It just doesn't make sense. It just makes no sense. It's a logical absurdity.
But what do you mean by it?
So in other words, it's not a fair question to ask. It's like you're not asking a question. Should we just strike that from the record? What do you think?
But like, isn't
But
God
why?
No, but what do you mean
not
by
logical
lift?
though? God isn't logical.
Basically,
What do you mean by lift?
the question is...
Yeah, so the idea is,
Either answer you give, God's not all powerful.
it's not just a question of being outside of logic, right? Because we can imagine that there are things down here that seem to be contradictory and yet, or paradoxical, and yet on a higher plane they can be reconciled. How does God know everything, but we also have free will, for example? Well, on some higher reality, the two can exist. So here, though, the idea of even saying a rock that God cannot lift is an impossible. It's just an absurdity. It's just not a possible thing to say. Yeah.
If God is a composite of all things,
Yeah.
and that can be broken down into good and evil, why are we incentivized to only be like a certain part of God, and otherwise good and not evil? Why is evil evil if it's a part of God, and why shouldn't we be like that?
Because we're supposed to use our evil parts in the pursuit of unity. In other words, the idea actually is that when there's real unity, there is no such thing as evil. Evil's an illusion that only exists when there is fragmentation, when there is separateness. The word for evil in Hebrew, ra, means broken up. That's literally what it means.
So how
Like
does
when you make a trua, I've said this before, but it's worth re-mentioning. The trua note means a broken note. And the word trua, the root is reish ayin, which means evil. So, and lehit ro'ea, which is the same root as well, means to break apart, means to splinter into many pieces. So the idea of evil means to see oneself as cut off from the rest of reality. That's how it's possible for me to be cruel. That's how it's possible for me to be selfish, even cruel to my future self, is to be broken off from my real self. So in reality, what we're trying to do is reconcile all of those opposites in the pursuit of wholeness, shlemus, where in a certain sense evil doesn't exist. And that's why down here there is a duality and there is such a thing as good and evil, but what we call the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, is one of many tools in our toolkit that we are meant to embrace and elevate in the service of unity. But that's a whole different talk, how to use evil for good, which is really important. That's why the Medrash famously says, on the sixth day of creation, God saw all that he had done, all that he had made, and behold, it was sixth day of creation. Behold, it was
Very good.
very good. It was very good. And the Medrash says, what do you mean very good? Every other day of creation is good. And when God says good, that means it's perfect, right? When something's good, tov, that means that is as good as it can get. So what does very good mean? So the Medrash says good means the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination. Very good means on day 6 was created the evil inclination, which means that you can get somehow better than good if you use evil in the service of good. It's one of my favorite topics, but I have to pull myself away from that because if we want to address the topic at hand, we need to move forward. Okay, so I want to approach it from two different ways. I want to use one classic answer, and then I want to use a deeper, maybe more subtle answer to answer this question of why are we here. So the classic answer, which is offered by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto of the 18th century, in Italy. Rabbi Luzzatto was an absolute prodigy. He wrote his first book on grammar, Hebrew grammar, at the age of 17. He was a proficient, unbelievably proficient in all of Torah, all of Talmud, wrote books on deep, deep Kabbalah, was driven out of Italy because people were afraid of him. He was post-Shabtai Tzvi, so they thought people who get a little bit too kabbalistic are too dangerous. And he was driven out, and he kind of died at the age of 40, and that was it. But before then, he created some of the most lasting and important works ever written. And in his book, Derech Hashem, The Path of God, which is probably the best overview of Jewish philosophy and metaphysics that you'll ever read. In other words, it goes systematically through the entire system of Judaism. What is God? Why did he create the universe? What are human beings? What is our purpose here? What is the Torah? What are the mitzvahs? What are the angels? What are the prophets? What are the mitzvahs? Everything. Anything you ever want to know, and in a very, very logical and straightforward read. It's a very, very good resource. So the Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, towards the beginning of his book, says, why did God create the world? Why did he create human beings? Why did he create the universe? And he says the following. He says, it is the nature of anyone who is perfect to be a giver. Giving is a great attribute. Anyone who you admire is probably a generous, kind, giving person. Now, they may be a little bit of a stick in the mud, or, they might be strict, but they are, at their heart, incredibly kind and giving. And the reason why is because when you yourself are whole, you have a natural desire to want to spill over that wholeness to another. Does that make sense? There's only one problem when it comes to God.
There is no other.
There is no other to give to. So, in an act of beautiful strangeness, God says, I'm going to create an other that can be capable of receiving the good that I have to give. Okay, 2 hands went up. Yes?
Can't you say angels are encompassed in that?
Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Why us? Why are we the recipients of that good? Great, good question. To that right now.
To be a god, you have to be a god over something, of something. So if someone was to say that it was for selfish reasons, that to be a god, you have to be a god of something,
a
god over something, how could you say that God didn't do it from a selfish reason to be a god over something?
Why do you have to be a god over something?
Because to be a god, you have to... The definition of God is a higher power, higher than what?
No, the definition of God is the source of all of existence. We're stuck in this, I don't know what theology it is, but it's like God's up there and he's lording over me.
Christian.
No, there is the truest, right? It is the cause and the permeation of all of existence, right? That which causes, brings into being, and penetrates all of being. That's God.
So to be the source of an existence, that's the an existence, right? So
okay.
Your definition
so
of mine are
very good. Good.
Dissimilar.
So that's why there is the way that we understand God as being the source of all existence is only once existence exists.
Yeah.
Before that, God is God, whether or not there's an existence. What is he? He is the absolute, he's all. Or in the words of Kabbalah, he's the Ein Sof. There is no end. Meaning you can't even describe what he is, you can only describe what he isn't. He ain't an end. So that's what they say God is. Yeah.
How are we an other? what part of us is not part of God?
All right, fine. Let's get there. We'll get there. Okay. So let's go with the simple understanding, and then we'll address your question of, isn't all existence just an illusion anyway, because we're all part of God? So, all right, first thing is, God says, all right, I need to create an other who's capable of receiving my good. Now, God's good, the kindness and the good that God wants to give, isn't just giving us a sandwich. It's not even just giving us a new Ferrari. It is the ultimate peak of good that can be given, right? The greatest good that it is possible to give, to bestow. Now, what good is that?
Life.
Free will.
Why is it free will?
I mean, if you just created things and ran it and clicked a button and then it did that, it's like, that's cool, but if you see them run around and like make their own choices, kind of...
Okay, you're right, but you're skipping a few steps.
Growth, maybe.
Growth.
To have a purpose.
Okay, to have a purpose.
To choose to connect to you.
All right, to choose to connect to you. Anyone else? What's the greatest good that God can give? What's the greatest good?
Life.
What is the greatest good?
To be God.
Yes, Ben. The greatest good is God. That's why in English and German, the word for God is the same word for good. Did you ever think about that? Gut. Sometimes you hear something, you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I've been saying that my whole life. So they weren't so bad. They weren't so stupid, the Germans. Let's put it that way, okay? They were very clever people, very clever people. I was stopped myself from saying they weren't so bad. They were so bad, right? They actually
Not
were.
anymore.
Yeah, not anymore, usually, although anti-Semitism is actually very much on the rise. Have you spoken to, what's his name out
German
there?
guy.
What? Yeah.
That's a free will.
Ferdinand. Have you spoken to Ferdinand? Yeah, he has a crazy story. He grew up in Berlin. He had to move schools because it got out that he was Jewish. Let's just put it that way. Yeah.
Isn't the act of creating us that inherently need God's goodness like an evil act, because he's creating a whole system of people that are suffering?
Okay, we'll get there. Great question. All right, so let's take it slowly. The greatest good that exists is God, and therefore the greatest good that God can bestow upon another is to be God. But obviously, you can't do that because there's only one God. So what's the next best thing to being God?
Being like God.
Right. Now, how can you be like God?
Angel. No.
Well, what does it mean to be like God? Now, yeah, okay, fine. Now, there's one issue, one problem, one small problem, that there's a major difference between us and God. There's a lot of them, but one of the most fundamental ones is that God is the source of his own existence. In other words, he is not a created being. He is, was, always will be, transcends time and space. He is what is. That is it. The name that we have for God, Yud, He, and Vav, and He, means the perpetual state of being. It's a cool definition, huh? So he exists of his own right, and we don't. We are created beings, and therefore, to a certain extent, we don't deserve our own existence. We didn't do anything to deserve to be alive. Yes.
But again, isn't that the same as angels? They only exist.
Yeah. Okay, we'll get there. You're right, angels are also created beings. Now, in order to be like God, we have to do something similar to being like God. God is not a taker, he's not dependent on anything, right? Nothing outside of him is what gives him life or sustenance. But we do. So the next best thing that we can do to be God is to not create ourselves, but to do something that is something like creating ourselves. What does that mean? Earning our own existence. It means doing something after the fact that means that we have somehow merited or justified our existence. Now, what tool is that? Now you can say it. Free will.
Oh, free will, thanks.
Right? Free will. Free will is the mechanism by which we can earn our own existence. And in doing so, somewhat emulate God in the sense that we have now not simply taken good, but we've actually earned our own good. And that's how we can be as close to God as possible. Now, why that is necessary, why doesn't God, many people will ask at this point, why doesn't God just give us a universe of good and we'll just be the happiest people living in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory? And the answer is because that's not the greatest good. Because the greatest good is not to receive. And I think we intuitively know this, that whenever you get something or you receive something, when you take something, it does not feel as good as if you had achieved it or earned it on your own. In Kabbalah, this is called the bread of shame, the Nahama de Kisufa, because when you take or receive something that you did not deserve, there is always a level of dependence, a sense that I'm getting this because I'm lacking, not because I'm whole, not because I'm developed. What?
So is charity a bad thing?
Yes, it is.
So I shouldn't give tzedakah?
No, that's not what I'm saying. So Maimonides has several levels of how to give tzedakah. The worst and lowest level is I walk up to a poor person and I say, here, has $5, right? A better level of tzedakah is to anonymously give. Why? There's less shame. An even better way to give tzedakah is to give someone a loan. Why? Even less shame. Because they say, don't worry, I'll pay it back. What's the highest level of giving tzedakah? Giving someone a job. Why? It's the most minimal amount of shame. See how this works? So it's clear, I think it's clear, that the greatest good that we can have necessitates free will. However, there's a small bug in the system. And that is that if we have to have free will in order to achieve the greatest good, that means that there's a possibility of failure. That means there's a possibility of suffering. It means there's a possibility of evil. And the whole floodgates open. You see how the world is the way that it is according to the Jewish perspective. Evil, suffering, all these things have to be in the system. Otherwise, there's no way that we can achieve the very purpose for which we were created, which is to have free will, which is to earn our existence, which is to emulate God. Yeah.
But like, I understand.
That's why it can't be an angel. You get it?
Yeah,
Good?
yeah.
And that's why there has to be suffering. Now, we haven't answered your question yet, Sammy. Isn't everything just an illusion? So how are we separate from God? But we'll get there. Yeah.
But I get that you have to have a bit of struggle in order to get somewhere in life, and everyone has to have that element of evil and suffering.
Yeah.
But at the same time, why didn't God just, like, there is a point where there's struggle, but then there's pure evil.
Yes.
Like, so why did God create that pure
Good,
evil?
great. So version 1 of reality is exactly as you're describing. The Garden of Eden. There was struggle, but there wasn't this horrific, tragic evil that we see around us all the time. The problem is that when you give human beings free will, you really have to give them free will. It can't be just a game, which means that if they mess up, there's real consequences. And when they messed up, that meant that they invited in the possibility of actually committing evil. Yeah.
I really hate to ask this question.
Please, go ahead.
Because it's annoying.
I'll tell you if I'm going to answer it or not.
You've created a very nice system of logic.
I didn't create it.
No, okay. You've explained a very nice system of logic as to why God made everything that way it is.
Mm-hmm.
If you define God as a completely omnipotent being,
Yeah.
no limit to theoretically, conceptually what he can make,
Yes.
there is a system which gives us all the satisfaction and joy and kindness, every positive aspect you've mentioned with none of the negatives, and he could have implemented that.
Yeah.
Because by definition he is all-powerful, so why didn't?
Because that's creating a rock he cannot lift. Because in order to say, I'm going to make you into someone who's receiving the greatest good, but that good involves you being a taker, it's a logical absurdity. It's not, it's just X equals Y. It's just false. It just doesn't go. It's not. So you and I, we could wax philosophical, but could we have made a better world, a more perfect world? But I think that if you work at it backwards and you say, well, we're here and this is the world we live in and therefore this must be the best of all possible worlds, right? Voltaire, right? Anyone here read Candide? Right? That was a critique. That was like a mockery of God. But okay, but the idea is that we are here and this is the world that we're in, and so that has to mean something if there is a God. So I think that I've thought it's something you have to think about for a long time. And I've thought about it for a long time, and I've mulled over and chewed on that very question for a long time. And no matter which way I get around it, doesn't mean that I'm right, but no matter which way I get around it, there's no way of avoiding the existence of suffering and evil. And that's because we live in a universe of finitude, which necessarily implies the absence of perfection. But that's going to be our second answer, so let's get to, I'll get to that in just a second. Yeah, go ahead.
If this is the best possible world, if this is the best possible world that we can live in, then it means that there is no chance of failure, because a failure would imply that there is a worst possible world which we could fall to. If you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yes, which is why the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that whatever we do, Mashiach is going to come. It's either going to come because we did the right thing or because we did the wrong thing, but either way, you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution, buddy.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Ben.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you have explained why God has created a world, but not the world. As in, why did he create this one? Why are there a billion species? Why is there this world and that way, this many humans and this many animals?
Okay. It's a good question.
Why is it not only humans? Why is it not only humans?
Yeah,
Why is it
okay.
not only...
It's a good question. It's a long answer. Part of the answer is, literally in 30 seconds, right? The great, okay. Actually, let's hold off on that because I'm going to introduce the second way of approaching our big question, and it might be answered through that, okay? All right, so far, any outstanding questions? Oh, is everything an illusion? Are we not just part of God? And the answer is yes and no. From God's perspective, everything is one, and everything is the same, and nothing changes, and he's above time and space, and there is no differentiation. The greatest magic trick he ever pulled is to create something called something outside of himself, which should technically not exist, right? So the question of how does anything exist at all that's outside of God if God is a unity is the hardest question to answer, and I'm not even sure that it's possible to answer. It's what falls under the subtitle in Kabbalah of Tzimtzum. And you could spend your whole life figuring out what Tzimtzum means, and I'm not fully there yet. Tzimtzum means God, so to speak, made himself smaller or contracted himself in order to leave a space in which he is not. Whatever that means.
Does that not imply that he's not all-powerful?
I think I just blew Shira's mind there. Like, you're like, okay, that's it. This is too much for me.
In every area of the world.
Yeah.
No, so that's the problem, is that of course God is everything. He never stopped being everything. And yet somehow there is some reality which we inhabit right now where I am not God, right? So there's different answers to this. The Hasidim understand the Kabbalah, the Kabbalah of the Arizal to say actually God is the source of everything and also permeates everything. Everything really is a manifestation of God. The Vilna Gaon and the Misnagdim said, no, that's not really what it means. We are actually in a reality where God is not, but he refills it with his halacha or with his glory or with something else that is very difficult to define. So, okay, I don't want to get too much into it because this stuff gets really, 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 really hard. So let's just stick to what we know and we will leave that for future discussions. Okay, but in any case, the answer is, from our point of view, from us down here, this world is very real, and we are very real, and we are not God, but there's something godly about us, and there's something that we can strive to, and that's what we're trying to do here. So the answer to your question is, I don't know. I don't know how it works, but it works because we're here. God is at the same time everything, ein od milvado, there's nothing else besides him, and at the same time, there's us and God.
Could you think of it like, imagine you had a weapon, which is really powerful, it's the most powerful weapon to ever exist. If you were to take it up into 1 trillion little parts, each of those parts, it wouldn't be a part of its power, it'd be nothing, so it wouldn't be the weapon.
Yeah, well,
it would be.
It's difficult to say that because God's unity is such that a real unity can never be divided into parts. A real unity is indivisible. So,
How can God put apart?
yeah.
How can
Okay,
God
so
put
we can
apart inside
wax
someone?
philosophical, but I really want to get to the second answer because, okay, let's just sum up. Okay, answer number one, the reason why we exist is because God had an inclination. He wants to, and this is the language that they use, even though it's a very difficult language to understand when it comes to God. What do you mean God wants? To want something means to lack something, almost literally, right? So you can think of it like this. If you have a glass that's half full, then it wants to be filled. But if you have a glass that's overflowing, then it wants to fill up another glass.
Inertia.
No, it's not just inertia. But what I mean is something that's overflowing has a deep love and desire to want to give to others. It's not because I'm lacking, it's the opposite. It's because I'm so overflowing that I want to give, right? So whatever it is, however we describe it, God wants to be a giver, or it must be that one who is perfect is a giver. And to be a giver, you want to give to an other. And therefore, he created us an other. But in order to give the greatest good, that other must fulfill certain criteria, which is it must be capable of emulating God. And in order to emulate God, we have to earn our existence. In order to earn our existence, we have to have free will. And that's who we are. That's human beings. Okay. That's answer number one. Answer number two, I think, is maybe more interesting, but maybe more controversial. Answer number two comes from the following riddle. I've seen it expressed by Rav Kook, who lived in the first half of the 20th century. He was quite a controversial figure in the Orthodox world, but he is certainly regarded as one of the most important Jewish philosophers who lived in the last century. And Rav Kook asks the question like this. The riddle goes like this. What does God lack? What does a perfect being lack?
Imperfection.
Yes. Very well. Very well done, Ben. How did you come to that conclusion?
Because I thought, what's the opposite of perfect?
Good. Okay, great. So interestingly, it's interesting that Jordan Peterson actually invokes this riddle sometimes sprinkled throughout his lectures. So I guess he heard it from somewhere. So I thought maybe you had heard it from him. But okay. The answer is, yeah. What does God lack? Imperfection. What does a perfect being lack? Imperfection. Now, this is kind of a word game because is imperfection really a lack? That's like saying that somebody who's really kind lacks cruelty. That's not really a lack. That's just the absence of something bad.
But
You see what I'm saying?
That if you come above evil, then that's better than good. So
Okay,
that's the thing.
good, great. You're thinking, Chai, you're on track. Okay. So what it means is like this. Rav Kook explains that there are two types of perfection. There is a static perfection, in other words, an unchanging perfection. Something like, if we were to imagine God before the world existing, does not change. That which is perfect does not need to change at all. In fact, there's no room to change. There's no time or space or anything like that. But there's another type of perfection, and it's called dynamic perfection. And that's the perfection that comes about through becoming perfect. In other words, it involves a process, a movement towards perfection. And that requires that the initial stage has to start with imperfection. So in order to think about this, you could imagine if I were to tell you, what is the perfect story? It's not boring. Something happens. What's a perfect story? Well, probably the perfect story involves something like one or more characters who has some inner lack, some inner character flaw, something that he or she must learn or overcome. And throughout the course of the story, they have to face challenges and obstacles that are going to teach them and show them how to repair themselves, to become the person they were always meant to be. Yeah, you would agree that's probably something like the perfect story. A lot of people say that that story is what's called classically the hero's journey, right? Which you can read about in Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces. So, Okay. So what that leaves us with is the following. Why did God create the world? Because God in static perfection is missing something. What is he missing? He's missing imperfection. But what that really means is he's lacking the demonstration of how imperfection can become perfect. That's something you don't have when you don't change. What it does is it shows you that imperfection can actually be part of the story of perfection. And in the same way that a story is amazing and beautiful and wonderful, precisely because of the character flaws, you would never change that story. You wouldn't say, well, okay, but what if this character was good to begin with? And okay, well then it wouldn't be much of a story. And when you do that, you incorporate all of the imperfection. You say that imperfection is part and parcel of the perfection of the story. The way I like to think about it sometimes is like, sets of infinity or sets of whole, the set of whole numbers, right, is infinite. But the set of whole numbers is lacking the set of real numbers, right? Any maths people here, right? So the idea, or like, it's lacking complex numbers or imaginary numbers or something like that. So what I'm doing is so God wants to show that perfection doesn't exist only in perfection. Perfection also exists in imperfection. Because when imperfection shows that it can become perfect, then it's part of that story. Is everyone following what I'm saying here? This is a slightly more subtle, slightly more difficult answer than the first answer. Okay? It's actually the same thing as the first answer, but said slightly differently. Yeah.
Isaac, if God is in a static, perfect form,
Yeah.
and then God is in a form where he creates an imperfection to become perfect.
Oh boy, here it comes. Yeah.
There's a transition between the two, which implies that something changed.
Yes.
In a static form.
This is the paradox, my friend. If God, let's sharpen the question. The creation of all of existence also means the creation of the dimensions of space and time, right? You can't actually have growth or movement without space and time. We're either moving or growing in space or in time, or usually in both. That means that there is a moment in which God created time. So what's T minus 1? What's the moment before God created time? What does that even look like? Yeah, but you hear it's an ultimate paradox. There is no such thing as time the moment before God creates time. So what do you even mean when you say the moment before? That implies there's time before time. You get what I'm saying? It's this thing will like cook your noodle for a long time if you think about it. So the answer is, again, it's impossible. It's a magic trick. We don't know how it works. The same way that we don't know how God takes his infinite unity and perfection and oneness and turns that into a plurality that's limited and finite. We don't understand how that works, but it's the same. It's the same question. Okay, so here we are in our story. God says, great, there's static perfection, but I don't need to demonstrate this, but I want to because imperfection doesn't really exist. But I will create the illusion of imperfection to show that imperfection can become perfect, and that's every story we've ever heard, right? And therefore, God says, I'm going to create a finite reality, bounded by time and space, bounded by the laws of physics, and bounded by the fact that we're all flawed and nobody is born perfect. But you're going to grow, and you're going to achieve your potential, and you're going to become and strive towards perfection. And that's going to be the most amazing thing possible. Now, according to this answer, what does God gain by creating the universe? Not quite.
Perfection.
Yeah, but he was already perfect. So we just got back to wherever we started from.
Transition.
Wait, it's a good question. Wait, I want to dwell on this, right? What overall was gained in this maths equation? We started off perfect, right? Everything was just one. And then God said, wouldn't it be a fun experiment to create imperfection and then see it become perfect? And then you're like, that was a fun race. We just got back to where we started. We were just here. We were already perfect. Why go through the whole process of, what did you do? What was gained in
Proof of concept.
proof of concept, okay? To just see that it could be done.
Process.
God's like, do you dare me?
I'll do it.
Process, good. Say more.
It's the transition between one to another. If perfect, I think, is the wrong word. I think you use the word whole.
Yes,
If
good.
you want to be truly whole,
Yes.
you have to be both not whole, and everything in between.
Yes, good.
So we have got the other. The
Yes,
negative side of it.
great, good.
Everything else.
I'd say like you can't define perfection without imperfection.
Yeah, but I don't think so.
Evidence that
You can,
it's
you can. You don't have to have the opposite in order to prove them.
But how
You
do
can
know
have
it's
perfection.
perfect?
Yeah.
You can't.
It's
You don't really
relative.
prove that
God
it's
doesn't
perfect.
need to prove anything to
but
anybody.
it's
It just
relative.
because it lacks nothing, meaning there's nothing
But
outside
how
of
do
it.
you know? How do you
Yeah,
know
exactly.
that there's not lacking anything?
I
You've got to
agree.
create
I-
something that's not perfect. to
I-
show
I-
that it is perfect.
Like, how do you know good? You need
I'm
a
not
relative.
sure I agree with the question
Why?
because you don't need a contrast to everything.
Right.
I don't necessarily accept that you
Jewish
need to
idea
know
you
what
do.
something is by its opposite. That's not necessarily true.
Not its
I think it
opposite.
is.
It's just there's no evidence that something.
But who are
is
you trying to
something.
prove it to? God is everything. So he's like, well, what's beyond the, what's in the, what's in the elephant graveyard where the light does not touch? That doesn't exist. It's everything, right? So there's no need to say, well, what's beyond, because there is no beyond. If I am everything, then I don't need any proof that there's not something outside of me. You see what I'm saying?
So was it for us to learn the process?
Now
of it?
hold on a second. Now, what I think you said is the closest to what I'm trying to get out here. And you, Chai, said, well, what you gain is not the sum of the equation. In other words, what you gain is not, oh, good, now we're perfect again, because you were just perfect. What you gain is the story. What you really gain is the entire process of the becoming. The becoming itself is something that you didn't have with static perfection. And so what I think this means, and you can disagree with me, I think this is a very, very controversial thing to say, is that the whole purpose of existence is the unfolding of the most beautiful story that could ever possibly exist. I think that's it. Now, some people will say, oh my, that is so mean and cruel and futile, and like, that's it? Just tells. But I think that if you really dwell on this, I don't think there is anything more important and more beautiful and more profound than saying that we are part of the unfolding of the divine story. If God were a process in time and space, it would look like the entire span of history. I think that's maybe the deepest thing I've ever heard in my life. That's why I saved it for the end. But what that means for us practically, because this has to be practical Kabbalah, is that we need to stop focusing on where we're trying to get to. Because the point, as we said earlier, Sammy, is not to be done. Don't worry, there's a time and place that's beyond time and space for being done. What this world exists almost exclusively for is to enjoy and to love the process, to explore and be absolutely exuberant with the unfolding and becoming of who we are and who this and what this world could be. And if we learn to love that and appreciate that, we will be genuinely happy people, because that's what this whole universe is created for. Okay, that's the second answer. Now, you can go home and do your homework and figure out how those two answers are actually the same answer. But these are just looked at from two different perspectives. One, I think, is from the perspective of God wants to be a giver. The other one is God lacks imperfection, so to speak, and therefore creates this wonderful divine play called imperfection becoming perfection. And we are actors in that play. So, hope you have fun. Okay, are there any final questions? Any clarifications? I know this is a bombshell, and when I really when I figured this out, I was like, well, that's on the one hand, that's a kind of a scary thing to say, because it means all of the evil and all of the suffering is for the sake of a story. And you could say, well, is that really fair? And I think the answer is yes. I think it is. I think the chance and the opportunity to be part of that story is worth it. Now, maybe I'm speaking from somebody who doesn't know nearly half the suffering that's possible to endure, and that's very fair. So maybe I'm not the right person to say that. But I'm not sure there's anything more worth living for. So there you go. Now, how do we become perfect, and how do we strive for imperfection becoming perfect? Well, it's for us Jews. It's the Torah. That's showing you how do we move towards wholeness, completion, perfection. That's really what we're here to do, is to reveal the unity of existence. How all the fractured pieces are actually really made up of one thing. And if you look at every single mitzvah in the Torah, the underlying principle is taking fracture and making it whole. That's everything. It's the whole Torah. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. God is one. That's why that's our core mission statement, because that's what we're here to do, is to reveal that truth. And it's the act. And you realize, by the way, that some of the things that cause us the greatest joy are reconciling and seeing the unity in the disharmony. That's why we like solving Sudoku puzzles. Seriously, it's like why we like solving puzzles, because you see, how on earth do any of these things fit together, right? You're like, oh, I see how everything fits together. That's amazing. It's incredible, right? How am I? I'm whole. I'm not a complete person. I'm broken off. Oh, I found my soulmate. That's the most rewarding and fulfilling thing I think I've ever experienced in my life, is seeing how I can become more whole out of two separate parts, and now we've created this unity, right? So much of our lives, the places where we derive the most joy is that process of taking the pieces and making them whole. So, good luck.